So welcome to session 7, How to Photographs Perform. I'm David Oresek. I'm the director here at Silvereye, and with their Zoom cameras on, you can see many of my esteemed colleagues before we begin discussing Kim Beck's kind of facilitation and the Paul Chaat and Bell Hooks lectures. But before we begin, I just wanted to do a quick introduction for Kim Beck, who is an artist here in Pittsburgh and professor at Carnegie Mellon. And I wanted to actually just read from her bio because I think it's really great and it gives a good, I think, impression of some of the performative aspects of her art practice. Kim Beck has created grand openings at the Grand Canyon and skywriting events from New York to Missouri. Moving fluidly between media, she has shown work on billboards along I-70 and in auto repair lots in botanical gardens, on rooftops along the High Line, New York City, and at the Walker Art Center, Carnegie Museum of Art, Smack Mellon, Socrates Sculpture Park, the Warhol Museum, OK Center for Contemporary Art, and many, many more museums, residencies, and awards. She grew up in Colorado, and now she lives in Pittsburgh, where she teaches at Carnegie Mellon. And Kim will give you a clearer sense of her practice as she continues. But before we go into this, I also want to do a quick plug for a Silvereye event. We have a series of photography workshops that are online on Zoom that I think may be interesting to some of you, and if you want to check them out. But in particular, two artists, Pittsburgh-based artists, one Jay Houston and Aleem Hurst, are doing a workshop called about world building. And I think they're two artists who really think carefully about how photographs perform as well in their work. So something I would certainly look to. And then finally, before I turn it over to Kim, I just kind of wanted to read the questions that Liz laid out in the packet and just kind of repeat them, because I thought it was a really good way of centering my thinking before and after these readings. And it has, I think, a really apt callback to the camped reading we read a few sessions ago. How do we recognize and acknowledge a photograph's performance? What etiquette should we demonstrate as audiences? Tina M. Campt tells us to listen with more than our ears and to pay attention to the low frequencies of even the quietest images. How do we respond respectfully to performances that we find lacking, prejudicial, or incomprehensible? How do we draw out different performances from the same photographs? And I think those questions really speak to those readings in really interesting ways. So maybe we can hold those in our mind. But without further ado, Kim Beck, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Liz. Thank you, UB Galleries and Silvereye. I'm really glad to have this chance to read with you and to read with everyone who's here. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm standing on in Pittsburgh and respectfully acknowledge that I'm located currently on the traditional ancestral lands of the Osage and Shawnee nations. The process of knowing and acknowledging the land that I'm currently standing on is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the ancestral Osage and Shawnee peoples, and that as artists, we owe a debt of gratitude to the indigenous peoples who came before us, without whom an arts of the Americas would not exist. So I am going to start sharing my screen and move into this conversation. That's the bigger topic, but also how do photographs perform? So the first thing, that I'm always thinking about, especially when I'm asked to consider leading a conversation, is, breaking apart what the question is. So I started thinking about, and it's something I think about in my practice, what is a photograph? And one answer is that a photograph is a record of light and time on a surface, that it's a record of a moment. This is documenting an image, light, or gesture captured on a piece of film on a surface or in a digital space. And then the second part is performing. So who and what is or are performing? So photographs as records of performance. One way to think about this, and people perform or represent different versions of themselves and characters to create identities, to advertise, to activate, to record in the service of art, of activism and advertising. The photographer looks out and looks at, and the photograph looks out and looks back. So photographs performing, which is the side of this equation that we're going to spend more time on tonight, is thinking about the ways that photographs change the way we see the world and the way that we see ourselves. And to paraphrase Ariella Ozule, the photograph is the unintentional effect of the encounter between these things: the camera, the photographer, the photographed subject, and the spectator. So how do we look, again, just to pose the questions here, how do we look at the mobility of photographs? But also to add, how are we performing as viewers? Is the act of seeing or viewing a photograph part of the performance? So when I was thinking about this this evening and thinking about these wonderful readings, the first thing that I started to think about was the way that I understand what a photograph is telling me. And I came to the Roger Fenton well-known Valley of the Shadow of Death, the photographs of the road in the Crimean War. And this photograph has been, or was, a hotly debated topic in relationship initially to ideas of fakery. The cannonballs in one photograph are on the road, and in the other photograph, they're all scooped off to the side. And the way the kind of question was posed about this photograph was always, did the photographer move the photographs? And if he did so, was that faking the photograph for some end? To me, this photograph has been less about fake or real and more about the performance of the photographer in changing the way we understand not just the viewer, I guess changing the way that we as a viewer will understand what this image is, but also in changing the way that he wanted to photograph it. So the photograph then performs in a different way based on whether we look at the one with the cannonballs littered in the road or the one where the cannonballs are off to the side. And, it was determined because Errol Morse went to investigate, and it was determined that gravity indeed works. And so the cannonballs they figured out there were 5 little rocks that moved, and so the cannonballs were indeed moved into the road to create this much more dynamic image. So the pair of those two, I always find really weighty in thinking about how we shape a conversation as makers, and then how as viewers we understand and receive that information. The second image that came to mind was this Grand Fury ACT UP project in the late 80s to activate a conversation around AIDS. And Grand Fury used the site of the bus, the edge of the bus where the advertising space normally functions. And they used the language of advertising, appropriating the Benetton ads of the 80s, to have these different couples enact the gesture of kissing in a very performative way, in a very self-aware way, on these posters to ask the viewer to kind of challenge their own way of thinking about what AIDS is and how to change that conversation and change the emphasis on creating or working towards some kind of cure for that virus. And as we're in the midst of and hopefully moving towards the end of a horrible pandemic, it also seems like a moment to think about how conversations can shift political action, and the role between art, activism, and advertising, which is sometimes quite separate when art is relegated to the interior walls of a gallery space, and sometimes when the context shifts, as it did here, but using this advertising space differently. So I'm going to show you a series of about 5 different artists' works, and these are artists' works that I came to in reflecting on the readings, but also in my own work. So the kind of structure I'm going to use for the rest of this conversation is to show you a chunk of artists who I'm really interested in and whose work I think opens up a conversation about the readings. And then it also points to things that I care about in my own work. Then I'm going to show you some of my work as well. And then we're going to move into a conversation about the readings. So that's where we're headed. So Carrie Mae Weems' Kitchen Table series is one that I imagine most of you are familiar with. One of the reasons, and if you're not, then I'm delighted to be able to share it with you, because I find these to be just really powerful photographs that are created in an intimate interior space of the kitchen table. They're performed because they are structured and staged for a photograph, and yet as a viewer, I feel like I'm witnessing an actual experience. So there's this strange performativity that as a viewer I engage in understanding and reckoning with what I'm looking at. The subjects who are photographed are not looking at the camera. They're in the midst of very private actions. The wall behind the seated figure is always, it changes. So sometimes it has nothing on it. Sometimes it has, a hanging. And in this case, we, see political posters. So I think the relationship between the images on the wall, the figures' interactions with each other, or their intimacy or privacy in their own space, starts to tell us something about reception, how we're receiving these images, how the photographer is taking the photographs. Okay, so the next group of images that I want to show you is another artist that I imagine many of you are familiar with, but she's somebody who came to mind when I was thinking about performance and performativity, and that's Francesca Woodman. Her long exposure, medium format photographs in this house interior are another way of creating self-portraits or portraits of spaces where the figure dissolves or moves in and out of the structure, architectural structure of the space that they're inhabiting. And as a viewer, I always feel sort of outside of these. I feel like I'm peeking in on a private performance between the subject, who is also the photographer, and their space. These photographs always feel like very intimate moments that aren't meant to be seen, and yet they're completely performed for the camera and performed for a viewer. Martine Sims said something that felt evocative, that she said it's about her own work. It's definitely me, but a shadow version, specifically a shadow self, like the way K-pop stars are manufactured. But I want my art to be real. I don't want it to feel like I'm manufacturing something. I want to actually manufacture that real feeling. I think for the last 2 photographers that I showed you, that's the space that's really interesting to me, between it being a performance and it feeling absolutely real. Whatever that space is where the performance exists. So the next artist's work that I want to show you is Stephanie Ciuko in 2 different series, her Dodge and Burn series and Blocking Out the Sun. And in her work, she very self-consciously uses the mechanics and mechanisms of both digital and traditional photography to refer to the process. what we're looking at in the back is a hand sewn, gray and white transparency screen, or the kind of thing that we would see when editing photographs in Photoshop. She's got green screen material used in hats and costumes. She's using all of these skin tests, color tests, photo tests, and they're set up as a display. And that display is so self-consciously aware of the process of seeing and being seen and presenting the action of seeing and being seen, that I really just like this work. It's all of these paper cutouts of things that are real, but we know that they're not real. We know that they're just facades or props. And then the second series that she did, looking at the World's, not the Chicago, the World's Fair, St. Louis Fair. And she did all this archival research, and in uncovering these photographs of this performed village from the Philippines that was performed in that fair, she used her hand to cover these photographs, to cover the figures and the people in the photographs. And she's written about this as here, by physically blocking the images with my hands, I attempted a direct way of intervening with an archive and thwarting the viewer's ability to fully consume the people and faces on display. Over a century after the original photos of the Filipino village were taken, my own body, sitting in the archives, becomes a temporary shield and a marker of defiance, while at the same time acknowledging that the images remain. The next artist whose work I'm going to show you is Ken Gonzalez Day. And these are the two series, are the erased. I'm going to just show you two photographs. The first is from the Erased Lynching series, and the second is called Searching for California's Hang Tree series. And in both of these photographs, we see a gathering of a white audience looking at the space where a Black body would have been hung. And they're images that are so unspeakable and so horrible, and yet we're looking at an audience that gathered to witness this act of murder. And then Ken, in an act of reclamation, has removed that figure, the body that is to be gawked at, and instead leaves us with this absence, which becomes an incredible presence. Jacqueline Goldsby has written about lynching photography, and she wrote, "But what do photographs do? What proof do they offer? If what they depict defies our notions of existence, what are we to make of photographs that depict what should not have been? We must conclude that lynching photographs bring the medium to the brink of nonsense, because the violence of lynching disrupts and disproves the certainty that photographs are presumed to confer. Linking the unimaginable to the imagined is the image. Lynching photographs from the turn of the 19th century until today define what we think of as unsightly and unseeming, indeed, of what it means to see it all." I think it's that last moment of what it is to see it all that I found so powerful about her writing and about these photographs. In this piece, it's installed on a billboard, and it enters the space of advertising in a way that Jacqueline Goldsby has written about these trees functioning as part of, and I'm not going to do well at talking about this, so I'm going to not talk at length about it, but the function of lynching trees in the growth of capitalism. But there's something for me as an artist just incredibly powerful about witnessing what at first seems to just be a tree, and then on further knowledge and further study and research, I learned this history of what this tree is. And the gap between what I first experience as a viewer and what I learn as I spend more time with it is something that I just find incredibly moving about these, the absence and presence of their history and information. So Felix Gonzalez Torres is another artist whose work many of you will know and whose work I've really responded to over the years. When he first was commissioned to do these empty beds in this Untitled Bed series, he made 24 billboards, and they were installed throughout the city, one for each hour of the day. And for the uninitiated viewer, it would seem quite powerfully like an empty bed. And that it is, and having an empty bed, this most intimate of things put into the gritty city space of advertising, is discordant enough. But when you learn more about the photograph and about the loss of his lover to AIDS, you learn that this photograph is, not just intimacy inserted into public space, but it becomes much more intensely private and tells a very personal story. So that kind of, again, learning what the photograph is, using that space, recontextualizing that image outside of a gallery space, something that that I've just always found really moving. So this photograph also is another one of his projects where this photograph of the bird is repositioned onto a billboard in the sky. And it's one that I had in the back of my mind, but I sort of forgotten about this image a little bit, and I realized that I kind of copied it. So we'll look at that later. But I just love that this vague sense of a sky with a bird floating in it is put back into the sky. So I'm going to share with you some of my own work now. And I guess I would say that, as David mentioned, I grew up in Colorado, and I moved to a lot of different places before I settled in Pittsburgh, and I've been here for a long time now. But the process of moving for me was one of being dislocated. And even now, being in Pittsburgh, I never quite feel settled. I think a lot of my work becomes about the place that I'm in and my awareness of looking at that place. So what I'm showing you now is a photograph of an installation that I did at the Indianapolis Museum of Art's 100 acres space behind the museum. And I made a lot of these arrow signs. A number of them had text on them, and a number of them were blank. In this one, I was thinking about the fact that people would end up taking selfies with these signs or being photographed by people with the signs. So some of them are just goofy and unnecessary, and others I think, are much more specific. But I imagined that somebody might be sitting on that log and they would have sat there because I had a sign that told them it was the best place to take a photograph. Sometimes when I'm creating sculptural installations, it's more about the photograph. I feel like I'm creating a thing that will then exist to be photographed. And while these worked as sculptures that people, might discover walking through the park, there was something about the flattening of the white onto the green of the background that felt like a cursor to me. And felt like a cursor on a computer screen. So there was definitely that relationship that I was conscious of. I did this project called Grand Opening, and I set up this little booth and handed out sheet cake and keychains and roses. And it was a way of, a sort of tongue-in-cheek way of celebrating the Grand Canyon. And wanted to play with the kind of time that you experience at the Grand Canyon, this long, slow time that erodes very gradually to create a canyon like this, and then the ridiculous short amount of time that a booth the scale of which is so tiny in comparison to this space. The kind of ridiculousness of this pairing was something that I was thinking about. So I also took a road trip. I'm going to show you a number of these now, where I packed into the back of my car this gold sign that says mine. And it was cut into the letters using the font of the Trump Tower. And each letter is about 3 feet tall. Is that right? 30 inches tall. And I was able to pack them out at a bunch of sites and take photographs of them. I wanted to think about the way that president in 2017, when I was, like many people, very angry at his election and taking office, thinking about the greed and his taking over of public spaces, thinking about this private land developer selling off lands that belonged in some ways to a public. And I had a lot of ideas that it almost became like a meditation on all these ideas rather than a very clear specific idea. But, I was thinking about Woody Guthrie's "This land is your land, this land is my land," thinking about who was claiming the land and who got to claim it. That was a moment as now when right to land, as whether it's immigration or thinking about Indigenous peoples, is a very debated and important way of thinking about the land that we're standing on. So I drove from California to Pittsburgh and then on to New York with my sign, and I propped it up everywhere. So this is in Colorado. This was in Capitol Reef in Utah. This was in Colorado, just off of Coal Mine Road. And I was thinking about all the different kinds of mining as well that one can do. I was thinking about gold mines and land mines and coal mines. And as we know, coal mining was something that was, a hotly debated bring back economy for the last administration. But I grew up near here. This is right near where I went to high school, and Coal Mine Road, there's all these different just names of roads and neighborhoods that relate to the history there. This is at Yosemite. So one thing I guess I should mention is the hashtag as well. And, I wanted to include that because it was the absurdity of a president who was using Twitter. It actually never stopped to be astounding and bizarre to me. And so it seemed equally ridiculous to fabricate a cutout of a hashtag and put it out in the world and have that relationship to the document of the installation of this sign. Just, again, the absurdity of placing and claiming something like the Yosemite Valley as either my own or some other fictitious mine. It's just, sometimes I wasn't thinking about it as mine as in Kim Beck's land. In fact, most of the time I wasn't. I was thinking about whose mine is it? Who gets to claim it? And this was photographed in Buffalo, actually. So hats off to Buffalo. It could just as easily be Pittsburgh. This was also in Colorado. And, as I was photographing, it seemed to me that this sign meant something different in a national park than it did in a cornfield, than it did next to the Courtyard Marriott on this culvert walkway. And I don't exactly know what it meant differently in each of those things, but I guess I felt like I should claim all of them for everybody if I'm claiming one of them. So the next couple projects I'm going to share with you are billboards that I made after hiring a skywriter to write different messages in the sky. And this one was part of the I-70 sign show, and the skywriter flew over Columbia, Missouri, and wrote a couple things. One of things that they wrote was next exit. I wanted to take the language from an actual road sign and stick it up there on a big billboard. And in repositioning it as a photograph of the skywriting, it became a fixed moment. It also then referred to those signs and maybe had the viewer start to think about them in a different way. And the different way that I was thinking about was there's a lot of apocalyptic end of times religious messages on billboards and that stretch of highway. So that was one of the ways that I was thinking about what next exit could mean. In Buffalo, Rachel Adams, the previous curator, had included me in a group show called Wanderlust. And so we had a skywriter there, and I had them draw arrows pointing at Canada and at the US. So the plane basically flew over the Niagara River, pointing to one side and then the other, basically delineating the border. And then those photographs were positioned on 10 billboards around Buffalo. So Ariel Azule says, even when the photograph does not show people, the area in which it was taken is always an environment created by human beings to be dwelt in. The photograph by itself is not political, but the space among people where it takes place can potentially become political. And that's something that I think about with my work, that it, in some ways, as here, these are just photographs of bumpy roads and potholes and broken asphalt. Here, the photographs are layered and collaged and put into these vitrines that are raised up so that the ground is raised up to the viewer. And, you know, I have had lots of really interesting conversations with people, including David, about why I haven't seemed to settle on a particular place that these photographs come from. But there's something for me about the road and all the things that the road can mean, from the asphalt, from the oil, from its use, in labor, creating automobiles that traverse neighborhoods and destroy neighborhoods. It'll go on and on, so I'm going to just quickly move through. But anyways, all of those things become political, but they're also just cracked asphalt. And so I've also taken photographs, larger scale ones, and woven them together, 2 different sites, and those photographs become the intersection between 2 different places. The last group of works of mine that I'm going to show you are just from this book that was published last year called Pavements, Potholes, and Repairs. And, here you can see, as you're looking down at the book, you see the overlay of the book onto the ground below you. And that's something I had thought about in some previous projects with grass and weeds, that the action of the viewer, the reading of the viewer enacts the photographs and enacts the book as it relates to the ground. And this moment I was really excited about because it looks like you, the viewer, are reflected in the water, but it's just a photograph. Okay, so now I'm going to just open up some questions for the reading, and then I'm going to turn off my screen share, and then we'll have a conversation. So, Bell Hooks is just, okay, she wrote this and we're going to talk about this. And this is a photograph of her, and she's so cheerful, and we're always reading these amazing things in this reading group, but I don't always feel like I can picture the human that is the person who wrote the thing. So I wanted to include a photograph of her, so she's embodied for us in some way here. In Our Glory, Photography and Black Life starts with a description of this photograph of Bell Hooks' father. And she talks about the photograph as something that helps her come to know her father in a new way. She says, standing before this snapshot, I come closer to the cold, distant, dark man who is my father, closer than I can ever come in real life. Not always able to love him there, I am sure I can love this version of him, the snapshot. And so now I'm just gonna give you a few statements from the readings that I found particularly resonant. Um, Unlike photographs constructed so that Black images would appear as embodiment of colonizing fantasies, snapshots gave us a way to see ourselves, a sense of how we looked when we were not wearing the mask, when we were not attempting to perfect the image for a white supremacist gaze. I hate posing. I hated cameras. I hated the images that cameras produced. When I stopped living at home, I refused to be captured by anyone's camera. I did not wish to document my life, the changes, the presence of different places, people, and so on. I wanted to leave no trace. I wanted there to be no walls in my life that would, like gigantic maps, chart my journey. I wanted to stand outside history. The word remember, evokes the coming together of severed parts, fragments becoming a whole. Photography has been and is central to that aspect of decolonization that calls us back to the past and offers us a way to reclaim and renew life-affirming bonds. Using images, we connect ourselves to a recuperative, redemptive memory that enables us to construct radical identities, images of ourselves that transcend the limits of the colonizing eye. The second reading we're going to talk about as a group is Paul Chaat Smith's Every Picture Tells a Story. He starts the essay off with a description of these lantern slides that he found, that his mother found, that his grandfather had used as a traveling preacher. And Paul Chaat Smith describes what these photographs would have been used for, which was likely to raise money for the church and for the mission. He writes, "To me, the Indians in the picture seem dignified, friendly, open to religious instruction and new cultural ideas. I imagine listening to Grandpa in a church meeting room in New York or Boston in 1937, hearing about the struggle for redemption and a better way of life. A people at a crossroads," he might say. The images underline his script. Indians in blankets with papooses on their back next to Indians in starched Western shirts and bandanas posing for the camera on their way to a Jimmy Rogers show. We see, ridiculously, an umbrella next to a wagon. On second thought, it's obvious the Indians are resistance fighters, pretending to cooperate. See that look in their eyes? They are American hostages denouncing imperialism in a flat, dull voice of Hezbollah. They steal the photographer's gun when he's not looking. From the Curtis stills to our own Kodachrome slides and Polaroid prints and camcorder tapes, it's obvious we are people who adore taking pictures and having pictures taken of us. So it should hardly be a surprise that everything about being Indian has been shaped by the camera. In this relationship, we're portrayed as victims, dupes, losers, and dummies. Lo, the poor fool posing for Edward Curtis, wearing the Cheyenne headdress, even though he's a Navajo. Lo, these pathetic Indian extras in 1,000 bad Westerns. Don't they have any pride? I don't know. Maybe they dug it. Maybe it was fun. Contrary to what most people, Indians and non-Indians alike, now believe, our true history is one of constant change, technological innovation, intense curiosity about the world. How else do you explain our instantaneous adaptation to horses, rifles, flour, and knives? The camera, however, was more than another tool that we could adapt to our own ends. It helped make us what we are today. See, we only became Indians once the armed struggle was over in 1890. Before then, we were Shoshone and Mohawk or Crow. For centuries, North America was a complicated, dangerous place full of shifting alliances between the United States and Indian nations, and among the Indian nations themselves, and between the Indians in Canada, Mexico, and half of Europe. The promise of film was to deliver what the stage could not, and the taming of the frontier, the winning of the West, the building of the nation was the obvious perfect choice. Indians and Hollywood, we grew up together. So So one of the stories that he refers to in the text is what Vine Deloria also wrote about, is this myth of the end of history, the telling of the story of the end of indigenous peoples in the US. So these are some of the covers of books that Curtis was involved in. And the use of his photographs is debated, but one of the things that they did, these photographs, was tell a story that wasn't true, which was a story of the end of indigenous peoples, when in fact it's a constantly changing and thriving, varied group of people in this country, Mexico, Canada, all of North America. So here's one of the photographs that performs in the service of telling that story. And I wanted to include this poster for the movie, The Indian Wars, because I really like that it says, this picture, which has been approved by the United States government and made under the direction of the War Department, has attracted the attention of the entire world. Okay, so I'm going to end there. I'm going to turn off my screen. And that's it. That's my introduction. And now we can have a conversation, which I guess I should be facilitating. So, so I will hope that you will all say something. And one of the things that you might maybe answer is how you think about photographs performing in these two essays.
Or who is performing? What is performing? And the audience.
Well, maybe I'll just start with a thought I was having, kind of thinking about the essays and thinking about your lecture, which is, beyond just like who is performing and what is the audience, just like the bell hooks and Paul Chaat Smith, the performances they're writing about are like not the things I thought of when I read the title of the topic, like how do photographs perform. They're much like that camped quote that was in the introduction. They're much quieter. They're more that kind of whereas I think some of the photographs that you pointed out, Kim, were the same things I thought about, right? Like Carrie Mae Weems or Francesca Woodman, kind of big, like dramatic performances, right? Like people that are kind of using kind of a theatricality to their performance that is really like wonderful and intense. But thinking about like the family photo of like that performance and how you're connecting to that performance, now you're reading that performance. I mean, not so much a question, but I just like, that's one thing I just loved about those two essays, was how subtle the way they were thinking about performance was compared to my kind of preconceived notion of like what a performed photograph is.
Yeah, the essays are so much about, I guess, performing an identity and constructing an identity and self-awareness for a viewer. I love the moment where Bell Hooks talks about this photograph of herself as a child, and it's lost. It's one that she brings to her aunt's house because she treasures it so much, and it shows her as like a really happy kid, and then it gets lost. And the identity that she now remembers but is no longer evident is this one of herself as happy. It's true. It's this very quiet idea of what the performance of a photograph is and how it functions. So you're right. It's the readings are a different way of thinking about what performance means and performing of self than necessarily the images that I look to.
Can I point out a detail that I found super interesting in Bell Hooks' reading that is related to Paul Chaat Smith's text, which is that photograph that you were talking about of her as a child that she loved, was when she dressed up as a cowgirl because she was so into Westerns. And this idea of Hollywood being a stage for demonstrating how to people how to perform indigeneity or cowgirls or cowboys, and that seeping into a childhood psyche of somebody like Bell Hooks, and that being a point of pride because she was able to achieve this performance. I thought that was very fascinating as a point of comparison between the two texts.
Same. Also, just the notion of the photograph or the film or an image in Hollywood as something that is a mirror that creates an identity, that creates something that maybe wasn't there before it existed. That's something that, reading the Paul Chaat Smith's, this notion that Indianness only existed when Hollywood started presenting images of Indigenous peoples. That was also, yeah. No one's talking. Well, I'll say it was something, there's the subtlety of those two readings, which I really do respond to. It's such a different thing for me also to think about them in connection to somebody like Felix Gonzalez Torres. And, what self is presented and performed in his work. How it's less about representation, less about an image of a person, and the representation becomes the person behind the camera. Oh, Melissa.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So I guess I'll add some things that I thought that were really interesting about both of the essays was that, and I love In Our Glory so much, this idea of fiction and reclamation in photography, and that they both had a sense of, they both had such like a sense of empowerment because of that reclamation of representation. I love the Paul Chaat comment about, it could be this or it could be that, that this, the multiplicity of meaning in a photograph. And I suppose Kim, and I love how Azule, how the idea of collaboration in, with the lens, the camera, the subject, the spectator, and I guess I felt really interested in that idea most in their essays, is this kind of reclaiming the narrative, but also just like the right, yes, and where it fails, like Justine is saying. Like I love the the power, Bell Hooks, where she says, such is the power of the image, it can give back, it can take away, it can blind, and this idea of how an image can, what an image conceals is also can be the most powerful thing. Like I'm thinking of like Takashi Homa and the mushrooms from the forest, and how you don't see the radioactive, you can't see it, it's invisible. So that, I don't even know where I'm going with that, but I wanted to contribute something. But I thought that was really, that to me, that's the limitation that like what Justine said, that reinforces the limitation of narrative, the limitation of objectivity, the limit, the multiplicity of everything. So I found that really inspiring.
Thank you. I like that.
Well, let me jump in on this. I joined this group just tonight. I just found out about it, so I didn't have a chance to do the readings. But you know, one of the ideas I played with is that photographs don't mean anything until we say they do. So if you get to ideas about reader response and reception theory for readers of text, right, that we imply and we layer upon the image all these possible meanings. And I think that's a danger sometimes we fall into, is that the meanings aren't there unless we say they are. Just a thought.
I also want to invite Justine to see if she wants to say anything in addition to your questions and observations about the readings, the tone and the self-representation, etc.
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
Thanks, Kim. That was a great presentation. I enjoyed listening to it. I just want to hear more from you. I thought it was interesting to pair those two readings together because the Smith reading felt so like humorous and he was making light of it. He like slams in a couple of punches, but it seems like he's kind of, you know, like he seems to be saying that Hollywood is the best version of Native American life or something. Like it's kind of a little bit like, I was thinking maybe he's writing this for a white audience, like not for a Native audience. Where, you know, I think that Bell Hooks is like writing to a Black audience and is really trying to help further, you know, equitable social justice, to think about like at what places the politics of representation are weaponized against Black bodies and where it can be redeemed. And then in thinking about that, I was like, except that first line of the book where she's like, the reason why my sister is a lesbian is because, and she, you know, she doesn't want to be, she wants to deny Black womanhood or something. There's some like kind of really cringy line, but other than that, I mean, yeah, I've read that essay before and I've actually stopped assigning it because I can't get over that first line. Do other people have a?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I had this essay in my class, one of my classes last semester, and that was something that students actually talked about.
And to Justine's point, the Bell Hooks article is included in this, Picturing Us, edited by Deborah Willis, which is very different than where Paul's essay is included. It's included in his anthology, which is titled Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong. So again, they both, like the you and the us, they,
right.
you know, they kind of declare the audience, the intended audience of the text.
I think your comment about tone is really interesting because both Paul Chaat Smith and actually Vine Deloria, who, you know, is this kind of key writer about Native American, at that point Indian rights, both have this tone of humor in the work, in their writing, and it is interesting. You know, he was the curator at the NMAI in DC for a long time, and I wonder if his role as somebody who works to, well, I guess that's not true because curators write in all sorts of different ways. I don't know. I'm just interested in his tone as well, his sense of humor. I wanted to also speak to Roberto, what you brought up. Reminded me when I was reading Ariel Azule earlier, thinking about talking with everyone tonight, I was reminded, you know, how she talks a lot also, not just about reception theory, but about our responsibility as viewers to make photographs speak. And I just found this Susie Linfield's The Cruel Radiance book. I don't remember the full title of that book, but Cruel Radiance. She says, it's our historic responsibility not only to produce photographs, but to make them speak. It requires transforming our relationship to photographs from one of passivity and complaint to one of creativity and collaboration. And it means regarding, the violators of human rights, that we're also the agents of change in making the photographs speak. So.
Well, I'll jump back in. That's an interesting idea that photographs speak, because if I follow through what I was saying before, they don't speak. We read them. We look at it, if you want to bring in semiotics and all that stuff, but basically we interpret the codification of the image. And there is a relationship between the image experience and the viewing of it. But actually, the viewer brings the interpretation understanding. What I find interesting a lot of times is in conceptual photography is that nobody talks about the concept. Where does it come from, right? There's a gallery here in Vienna that basically all of Austria has moved to more conceptual work than documentary work. That's what they decided back in the 80s, right? But nobody talks about the concepts. And they got some nifty pictures, as people in Rochester would say, nifty pictures. But basically, they don't, they don't have any background to it. Even the curator's descriptions don't talk about the concept. They try to describe the images. And I think that's a real bad use for curators. But anyway, going back to what you're saying, and the whole question of identity becomes interesting. Irving Goffman's work on presentation of self in everyday life is interesting in that context. So I'll be quiet for a bit. Wisconsin, Madison.
Yes, I wanna say that in listening to Kim, but also thinking about, I'm a curator at various museums around the country, but it's oftentimes the labels or the labeling or the title of a work of art, of a photograph, that plays a really important role in setting up the viewer to understand or think about certain ideas. I can't remember the photographer's name, and I'm sure you all know him, but there's a photographer that exhibited at the Art Institute in Chicago, and he photographed essentially crime scenes, but they were photographed a year or 2 years or 5 years after the crimes. And so in one instance, it was a White House and it was a walkway, and that was the scene of where an abortion doctor had been gunned down. But in looking at the photograph, there was absolutely nothing that would have suggested that event, but it was the title, which was simply the time and the day and something about the event that had happened, that triggers either our knowledge, if we knew something about that, or starts to paint a picture in our minds about what happened before and what happened after and what is that. So that then the photograph is really performing in our minds a sort of before, during, and after cycle that I think is a lot of what Kim was talking about, how a photograph really becomes a performance, yet it is just a still image of, a second in time, right? But so I think we have to acknowledge labels, and oftentimes artists think about them, sometimes they don't, but they play a big part in not only the reading the images, but then within a, say, museum setting too, understanding them singularly and as a collection or in a group or a series.
I think it's important also to think about, to go back to the Tina Kemp, I loved what you're saying, but adding on to that also about how we listen to pictures, to go back to the Tina Kemp idea of how pictures do speak, are those photographs that are taken non-consensually, that speak across time, that are maybe not read the same across fields of class, race, nationality, and that in those non-consensual photographs, that there's a kind of stasis of the body, a stare that is, imagining a future that's equitable, or imagining a future that is there to meet the injustice of whatever that moment is, so that it's not necessary, you know, that there's a kind of coding that ends up happening both through a posture and through a kind of reprisal of the archive. So yeah, just to Robert's point.
I want to see.
Great
Oh,
comment. That's such a great comment. Thank you.
I want to see if Biff wants to jump in because he put in a comment in the chat, and I think it's related to this conversation about the backstory, as Biff writes in his comment.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I don't. Sort of along some of the stuff that Roberto was saying is I'm always skeptical of having to know a backstory. As a viewer looking at a photograph, that's all I have to interpret from is the information in front of me. And so therefore I'm going to form an experience from that. And I like that. I mean, I don't mind doing that. I actually want to do that. And I also, and I mentioned in the comment though, but I also understand and expect that different people will have a different experience looking at images. And there's also another thing I said that I'm always, if I have to go and research what's behind the photograph, I question whether the photograph was successful in that sense. You know, I believe in visual language. I believe that the cues we read in all visual art are out there, and that it's a separate language from verbal language or text language, and that we shouldn't have to always rely on that. Not that you can't. I mean, there's certainly a place for that and a need for that in a lot of places. But I tend to want to just absorb the visual language and my impressions of what I'm looking at in that manner. However, now thinking about this and listening to some of the other comments, there is something, you know, people, you know, there's like particularly this historical image of Native Americans and stuff. I think that a lot of the impressions that those images gave, not only were they intentional, they were successful. They may not have been good, but they were successful in portraying a bunch of people in a certain light that they wanted to do. You know, it was maybe there was a colonialism aspect to it. And so then to find out that's a time when a backstory changes the context of the image totally. And in a historical sense, in a sociological sense, in a real world sense, we want to know that. We want to know when those times are. But we're inundated with so many images that we can't, as viewers, responsibly or in any sense even try to dig up backstories on every image we see.
Thank you so much. You just said some things that I move between when I'm thinking about work. And you also stirred the pot, because I feel like those are some comments that people might have some feelings about. I have some feelings about them. Like sometimes I feel the same way, that I want to be able to respond to the materiality and the visual experience of some work. But I know that I also love storytelling, and I love poetry, which isn't necessarily storytelling, but the language also can then change the way I understand something in a way that either adds or changes my experience. So I move between those two positions, but I really appreciate you saying that. You know,
How often do we find times when you find out things that make the photographs less interesting?
well, I don't know, less interesting, but less pleasant. I mean, those those lynching trees that I showed you are just beautiful trees, especially the second one, until you find out that they're historically important as lynching trees in California. I mean, it's just a beautiful tree until that history radically alters my relationship to it. And when I understand that, hasn't physically changed the photograph, but I can't look at it in the same way. And I just find that really interesting.
That it's interesting, but if that backstory of them being lynching trees is what in a sense creates the power of the image, and we don't have that in the visual content,
I would argue,
how do we reconcile that? You know what I mean?
I would argue that it's both, you know, that I can come to that piece. That one's a little tougher than some other projects where the story might not be as utterly horrifying or, you know, like the most bloody pit of American history. But there are for sure images that I look at that I think I can come to as a viewer without other information. Felix Gonzalez Torres, for example, The Bed is a piece that is just powerful. The context changes it. If I see it as a small framed piece in a gallery, my experience of that will still be quite different than experiencing it on a billboard. But I think the layers of information just continue to change and shift and add to rather than subtract from. I think that's the difference, is it adds to my experience of the image rather than.
Yeah. If I was just thinking, like, you know, this conversation about backstory is so interesting because to a certain extent, backstory, it's like so personally and culturally dependent, right? Like, if you are a Black person growing up in the South, you probably recognize lynching trees without anyone having to tell you. If you grow up as a Native American, you have a lot of backstory about how you're looking at these images that Paul Chaat is talking about. And of course, you know, Bell Hooks is writing about her father, right? Like an image, a sense of backstory that she's intimately familiar with, that she's kind of sharing with us. So I think there's all these degrees about backstory where, you know, sometimes it's like, how interested are you to read more? How interested are you to find out? How interested are you to challenge your conceptions? But you're pretty much, at least I feel like you're pretty much never going in cold, or like as cold as we might like, you know, a modernist notion to tell us we are, right? You bring all these things with you. And I love, you know, again, I love the Bell Hooks essay. I mean, you know, one thing I was thinking about what Justine sort of talks about, that kind of cruelty at the beginning, it's like a little much, and it definitely, I had never read this reading before, and it sort of sticks out for me, but it also like kind of took me to this place where it's like, right, we're talking about family here, and it's like, it's different, like, you know, than the tone for the rest of the essay, which, you know, for better or worse, right? Like that, you know, I was thinking about like the Roland Barthes reading, and it's like, we won't even show you the image, but you just carry it with you.
Talking a little bit more about backstories. There's a man named, well, he died, Nathan Lyons out of Rochester, Visual Studies. He did a number of books with just images. One was called Notations in Passing. And there's no backstory. There's no titles. It's just a visual design and layout and the sequencing, what he was interested in. So, I mean, the reader really brings in their own reading of the image without any backstory. And the backstory, if you want to have one, is actually within us, right? Those are the connoisseurs of photography, will bring a different understanding to the work than a pedestrian. So I think, you know, I think we really got to be careful when we start talking about the meaning of work and backstories, which I think started with CNN, didn't it? Didn't they have a series called Backstories? They would give you more background detail. That's when I first heard that term being used a lot, was called backstories. And how, you know, the stories, I would have trouble with the stories. I mean, if you go to the Black History Museum in, was it Greenville, North Carolina, where the first sit-ins were, you know, it's astounding, scary, negative photographs of those same hanging trees, but the people in the trees are still there, right? And that kind of thing. It's an experience we all should have. But, you know, it's, I'm rambling now, but okay. But I think we got to be careful when we talk about backstories, about the role of text in steering our understanding of something, and our own social background and political background that comes to the understanding of work. So anyway.
I think you're missing the point though about those Kenneth Gonzalez pictures with the lynchings, that the idea is if you continue to perpetuate Black bodies as spectacles of death, then you're reiterating the very power dynamic that puts one person dangling from the tree and the other people standing around. So by removing the body, he's reframing the picture so that we understand that the real horror of the picture is the white people. That's the real spectacle, is that all of these people came to enjoy this entertainment.
Well,
Right, so that's the horror.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. In some ways, I agree with you.
Just by reiterating the same picture, then you reiterate that moment in history. But that intervention allows us to reimagine, to rethink about that.
Right.
Oh.
There's also the play of the voyeur in those lynching photographs too. So it becomes a layered effect of us watching them, watching what originally happened. So.
What if
I want to also bring in Holly Linton. I see that Holly has put in a comment in the chat and want to make sure that she has an opportunity, or Holly has an opportunity to chime in.
Okay. I mean, I don't need to, but yeah, I tried to attach the JPEG just because these two prints of the same, you know, just thinking about photographs performing and the context and in the current discussion, just the idea of how, particularly with historical images, you know, how they're reframed or you know, the various printings and croppings. So I don't know if people are able to open it, but it's, you know, a very tight print that was made, same photograph of the minstrel poster, and then a second print that has the context, and then the, you know, the other poster of the Wild West, and also because we were talking about the West. So same title, you know, so it was just interesting to see them together in the collection. And just obviously I think they perform in very different ways, where one is very straightforward and the other is a conversation between the elements in the photograph. And
I would also
I was just gonna say, yeah, if you search for the image, you know, they'll come up if you do a search, if you can't see the JPEG.
I would also say that we shouldn't forget that all of you are very experienced with photographs. So, you know, you're able to analyze and sort of compartmentalize and categorize and evaluate images in a different way than, say, the lay people can. So you bring a lot of knowledge to your, or with your eye, you know, and you make constant references to other material. And so that's powerful and should always be acknowledged.
I think that was also part of the point that Paul was trying to make in his text. Hollywood being a great engine that generates images that we consume all the time, and shared reference points for all of us, whether those reference points are potentially damaging or reifying certain notions of a group of people.
I think that's also a kind of key point in Our Glory, where we have Bell Hooks experiencing those pictures in her hallway in two different ways, sort of like as a child, where she is kind of trapped by them and she doesn't really get to say who, like when her picture is taken and she has to pose for it. And then when she becomes this scholar of imagery and visual culture, and she has a way more self-conscious relationship with photography and what it might mean to have these this like alternate visual history happening in her own hall. And so to Anne-Marie's point, and I think that's you know, what's available, how a photograph might perform really kind of depends not just on context and backstory, but where you yourself are in your life.
I love that, Leo. I was just going to say it helps me also think about the photograph not as the end point, but as a center point, like that there's the receiver and there's the maker, and the camera and the photograph are somehow in between these things. And it's just one stop in that process.
There's a part in Bell Hooks, well, in many different parts. Bell Hooks talks about the wall, and it's interesting to actually, Holly, thank you so much for this photograph, or these this pair of images, because I see the wall here, and Bell Hooks talking about the wall of her grandmother as a counterpoint to the photo album, and we see here the wall. And I also noticed that on one of the images, there's the Roaring West featuring Buck Jones, like this idea of the Western sort of being pervasive in all of our in the consumption of culture and urban space, whereas the wall that Bell Hooks's grandmother keeps, that's a sense of that's a place of protection, and that's a place of also creating family lineage, and that's also sometimes a little frightening, sometimes welcoming, and comforting. So yeah.
Melissa, is your hand still raised or re-raised or perpetually raised? It's not raised. You're muted and hand raised.
I just want to piggyback on Leo's comment and how also in response to, I think there was a previous comment earlier about how photographs don't speak, or something to that nature. And I would say that Leo's description did a really nice job talking about the kind of fluidity of a photograph, and that these photographs as these kind of shape-shifting objects that change over time, that maybe they don't speak, but they breathe and they move and they shift, and we have different relationships with them. So we change, but so does the photograph. So I would say that it has its own identity. And another point I wanted to make about the two, I guess another comment, not really a point, but a comment about the difference in tone and the difference in style in the two essays is that we're talking about snapshots versus what was it, magic lantern slides, and the circumstances in which they were made and viewed were entirely different. And the magic lantern slides being these kind of rediscovered artifacts that had, very little, information and context, and, that kind of imposition of history that was placed on them with, aside from, other histories. But yeah, I mean, the tones were totally different. And I don't know, I think that's an interesting, contrast between them, is this relationship to this kind of subversion of the white supremacist gaze with Bell Hooks, this rebellion and this reclamation of the wall and the space and the authenticity of your representation, versus imposing that or projecting it onto these images that were constructed, basically. I don't know.
You brought up an interesting point, many points actually. But the question that keeps coming up tonight to me is, why do we believe what they tell us? I mean, are those really hanging trees, or are they just interesting trees and they tagged a story onto it? When I used to live in Buffalo, I did a series called The Wild Dog of Heat Street.
Well, I can actually answer that question, because I actually have experience working with Ken Gonzalez Day, and he wrote a book called Lynching in the West, which he wrote. It actually creates an exhaustive an appendix that created an exhaustive list of all the historical lynching photos, which he collected from extensive research. So as an artist, he is somebody who makes certain that when he presents these images, that there are information that comes with the images. He actually does not want these images to be just appreciated for their aesthetics. And he goes to great effort to share that information in all sorts of ways, including the book itself. So yeah, I think that there's a big difference between artists who just want to present images as visual experience versus images that come accompanied with information.
So would you say he's more of a visual anthropologist or visual?
He's a scholar and an artist.
Okay.
There's a lot of ways to be an artist. I want to push back on what you've said a little bit, Roberto, about the object or the photograph not holding any of its own information. I really loved what you said, Melissa, about the object being, or the image being a shape-shifting, breathing thing that is part of, and what you said also, Leo, that changes and moves with time and with us and with our own experience. One of my earliest experiences as an artist, well, I don't know earliest experiences. After college, I got a fellowship to go work with Aboriginal artists in Australia. And I was a Q-tip deliverer and paint giver and canvas roller. And I just worked in the little art shed. But what was really interesting and shaping for me as an artist was learning that artists were making paintings to be sold for a market that looked like modernist paintings, that also contained very real, specific information about a landscape and land that I didn't have access to. And that different people in their families wouldn't even have access to that information, that there were layers of understanding and meaning that you had to be initiated into. And that the paintings could be seen and read in so many different ways, and that they didn't contradict each other. They could function in all those ways at the same time. So I just want to share that with you, because for me, it was really the moment that I think created how I think about art making.
Thank you. I'm gonna wrap it up for us, I think, on that note, which I think is a really wonderful note to end on. And just thank you so much, Kim, for kind of guiding us through and putting together that wonderful presentation. We have one more stop on the road with the great John Opera will take us through how our photographs made, and that will be on April 20th. So mark your calendars, and we will have the readings up probably this week, because I think we're settled on the reading. So look for those. One, I think, will be a return to Zelenska, which we read kind of earlier in this session. And I think it'll be a really interesting way of revisiting some of those ideas and a lot of new ideas as well. So yeah, thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you in a month.
Thanks, everyone.